the early years of the 1900s, brand new, technologically advanced passenger ships were plying the waves through the Atlantic Ocean, heralding a golden age of seafaring that saw travellers crossing the sea in unmatched comfort and at astonishing speeds. Those ships were called Oceanliners, and within the span of 50 years, passenger ships had transformed themselves from glorified sailing ships under 3,000 tons to enormous steam-powered liners 10 or 15 times bigger. It was a golden age of technology, and it sparked some fierce rivalries. The White Star and Cunard lines, both running passenger liners on the transatlantic route under the British flag, were in a desperate contest to win over clientele by offering passage aboard the grandest ships yet put to sea. However, on continental Europe, German lines like Hamburg America and North German Lloyd were sick of playing second fiddle. They had introduced a whole new standard of luxury back in 1897 with the launch of the revolutionary liner Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse and a series of impressive running mates. But since then, British shipbuilders had bested them. With the British sparing no expense to churn out the finest and fastest liners the world had ever seen, it would seem that it was time again for Germany to show the world what they were made of. The result would be ships bigger than Olympic and Titanic, a trio that would hold the size record between them for over 2 decades. It would spark a new chapter of the history of the ocean liner, one which started out gloriously, but would ultimately not go the way that the Germans had hoped. It's an epic tale of triumph, loss, and rebirth. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today we'll look at 3 special ships: the flagship, the floating hotel, and finally, the Giant. They were 3 of history's greatest ships. They were the German superliners. Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. She was a ship that altered the course of maritime history forever. It introduced a new breed of ocean liner which reigned supreme for the better part of 15 years. Since the beginning of the 1800s, the biggest ships in the world had each, in turn, been British, with the occasional American interjection, but in 1897, the Kaiser Wilhelm changed all of this, and for the first time, the world's largest ship was German. Way back in 1889, during a visit to the Harland Wolff shipyard in Belfast, the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been particularly fascinated by the White Star Line's RMS Teutonic. After seeing firsthand the size, luxury, and power afforded by the British liner, the Kaiser is said to have turned to an aide and said, "We must have some of these." And upon his return to Germany, the wheels were set in motion to build up Germany's presence in the North Atlantic passenger trade with a fleet of liners that would surpass those in service by Cunard and White Star. Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse would be the first ship to be built with these aspirations in mind. In fact, the ship was so successful, she spawned 3 brilliant running mates and even a close contender, the SS Deutschland. In 1907, Germany's dominance of the waves was at last shattered. Cunard Line introduced their own 4-funneled superliners, and again, Britain led the way. For the Germans, this of course would not do. Ocean liners had stopped just being private enterprises. They were now representatives of their own home nation's might and ability on the world stage. It's no wonder that at the same time Britain and Germany began to race to outdo one another with their passenger ships, their armies and navies were doing the same thing. With Cunard Line's Mauretania and Lusitania ruling the waves, and White Star Line working on a pair of superliners of their own, Germany had to respond, and they would have to do it in a big way. At the Vulkanwerke shipyard in Hamburg, Germany, kill plates were laid in summer 1910 for a monstrous liner that would dwarf the British ships and re-establish Germany as a world leader. Almost 3 years later to the day, in June 1913, the finished ship steamed on its maiden voyage out of Cuxhaven bound for New York. She was the largest ship in the world by a fair margin, and on her bow was fixed a massive bronze eagle clutching a scroll which read, "Mein Feld ist die Welt." My field is the world. The ship's name was Imperator. Imperator was a monstrous ship for her time, the first Oceanliner to break the 900-foot length record and displacing some 53,000 tons. As always, the bigger the ship, the greater its amenities and standards of luxury, and in this regard, the Hamburg America line was keen to show the British how it was done. How this absolute marvel of a ship came to be is a fascinating story, and it starts with one brilliant man. Albert Ballin got his start in the shipping industry at age 17, when he took over his late father's maritime booking business. Under his guidance, the company began to thrive because his new and innovative ideas for increasing both efficiency and revenue had been a resounding success. The company would continue to grow under Ballin's leadership, and eventually he would find himself as the passenger manager for a shipping company called the Car Union Line. He led the company in a successful bid to undercut rivals on the migrant run to America. The effort lasted a decade, and one of the rival lines he had bested was Germany's Hamburg America line. In a twist, Hamburg America and Car Union announced their merger in 1886, spelling an end to the years-long rates war, but arguably, one of the most prized assets won by Hamburg America in this merger was their brand new passenger manager, Albert Ballin. His sharp business acumen and design sense made him invaluable to the company, and in 1899 he was promoted to General Director of the line. But not content to merely keep the company on a stable course, Ballin had a grand vision for the future of ocean travel that would ultimately shape the industry into what we know it as today. Although he had got his start offering dirt-cheap transatlantic passage, Ballin's plans for the future of Germany's liner fleet were far more grandiose. He was a true visionary and risk-taker, and he desired not just to manage and maintain the status quo, but to push the shipping industry as a whole to evolve. Having spent years handling booking for steerage passengers, he was keenly aware of some of the drawbacks involved with sea travel. He envisioned a world where passage aboard a ship was no longer an ordeal to be endured, but an experience to look forward to in and of itself. Albert Ballin became the father of the modern cruise industry when, in 1891, the SS Augusta Victoria set sail for 6 weeks on the world's first pleasure cruise. The move in itself was a stroke of genius. Hamburg America Line had found that many of their passenger ships were becoming a money drain during the colder months. Bad weather and passenger aversion to a rough crossing had kept the line from being profitable during the winter, but by commissioning ships to run off-season Mediterranean pleasure cruises, the line's ships could remain in service even during the coldest months of the year. The idea was a hit, and travellers adored the sightseeing and shipboard accommodations. A voyage on a ship was no longer simply about the destination, the voyage itself was its own reward. As we now know, Ballin's daring idea to rethink ocean travel would go on to shape the future of tourism and birth a whole new industry in and of itself: cruising. Another secret to Ballin's success was the fact that he found favour with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who'd been quite vocal in his mission to see Germany lead the world in the luxury, speed and size offered by its passenger ships. The Kaiser's patriotic vision, mixed with Ballin's business acuity and design ingenuity, made for a powerful combination. Because of this, Ballin's vision for the Hamburg America fleet came with the Kaiser's blessing, and Germany would finally be able to give the British a run for their money. Ballin knew just how they would do it, by building the 3 biggest ships in the world. Work on Ballin's proposed grand trio of liners had commenced in 1910 at the Vulcanwerke shipyard, and this was quite a significant undertaking for the designers and shipbuilders alike. It would be the first time that a German shipping company and German shipbuilders would produce something of that scale. The last German liner to hold the size record had been the Kaiser in August Victoria in 1906, but this new generation of ocean liner would be twice as big. It was a daunting task, but Ballin knew that the timing was perfect. Cunard and White Star Line had spent the better part of the last decade trading blows by way of their ship design, and now Ballin was able to make use of the lessons that had been learned. Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauretania had now been at sea for about 3 years, and they had experienced teething troubles Ballin would be able to avoid. He took notes from White Star's Olympic-class ships as well, and put them to good use in his new superliners. Imperator had been designed specifically to outdo the Cunard and White Star ships by elevating the passenger experience and transporting fare-paying customers in unbelievable luxury across not 3, but 4 classes. But beneath the sumptuous comfort and luxurious fittings was the steel skeleton and mechanical heart of an ocean-going giant. Imperator made use of Parsons turbines, immensely powerful engines. Cunard had used an arrangement of 4 turbines, each driving their own propeller on Lusitania and Mauretania, and Ballin recognised the arrangement worked well for ships of this scale. He opted to do the same thing with Imperator, and no fewer than 46 boilers would supply steam for 4 enormous turbines, which combined to generate 60,000 shaft horsepower. The brute force of these engines meant that Imperator could surge forward at about 23 knots, only 2 knots slower than the Cunard ships, despite the fact that she was larger by 20,000 tons, in itself a highly impressive engineering accomplishment. Imperator's interior design was no pale imitation of her British counterparts either. No, she would be the final word in luxury at sea. Ballin had banked on the fact that an improved standard of luxury would win out over sheer speed. He'd seen this work for the White Star Line when Olympic was introduced to much fanfare, and now it was up to him to best the standard, and to do it, he'd need to rely on a genius. Fortunately, he knew just the man. Charles Meues was widely renowned for his work designing the famous and exquisite Ritz and Carlton hotels. He would be the man to design Imperator's interiors, but his involvement presented another interesting twist for the ship's conception. Meues' business partner was a British architect named Arthur Joseph Davis, and he had been contracted to design the interiors on Imperator's newest British rival, the Aquitania. The 2 business partners would now be working for competing companies at the same time. Cunard Line and Hamburg America came to an agreement. Meues would work in Germany designing Imperator's interiors, and Davis would stay in England working on Aquitania, and neither business partner was allowed to disclose the details of their work to each other. Like Ballin, Meues was a man of exacting standards, known for his almost obsessive eye for detail and painstaking insistence on precision. His work on the Ritz hotels, the Royal Automobile Club, and dozens of private residences was deeply revered. He had actually worked with Hamburg America Line and Ballin before, first on the SS America and then the Kaiserin Augusta Victoria. His use of clean, white spaces with tasteful gold detailing had become something of his signature, and wherever Meues' designs went, the affluent would inevitably follow. But in this project, he had his work cut out for him. Imperator boasted vast, open public spaces and staterooms, the likes of which had never been seen on an Oceanliner before. With much more space to fill to the brim with splendor, Meues got to work designing some of the grandest rooms of his career. But there was a reason that Meues was working with so much space, because it all came down to the way the Imperator had been laid out. Crucially, the ship had broken with tradition. For 15 years, the world's largest liners had sported 4 funnels. The number and size of the ship's funnels had become associated with her size and power itself. But as ever, Ballin, never one to follow tradition, grabbed the opportunity to innovate. Imperator was bigger than any ship yet built, but she would only have 3 funnels. It meant that the ship's interiors wouldn't be split up by towering uptakes which reached from deep down into the boiler rooms right up to the funnels. In older ships, the public rooms had to be designed around the uptake's casings, but with only 3 funnels, it meant that the 53,000-ton Imperator's rooms could be bigger because the uptakes were fewer and spaced wider apart. Between this bit of brilliant engineering and Meues' exacting eye for detail, what resulted was nothing short of majestic. Imperator's first-class spaces were some of the most beautifully decorated and spacious ever put to sea. To say the ship set a new standard for luxury would be an understatement. The first-class spaces were palatial. Almost amidships was the towering Ritz-Carlton restaurant, an upscale dining experience to rival any found on land. Charles Meues, of course, had a long-standing history, having worked with Caesar Ritz to design his hotels, so he was able to offer full Ritz-branded dining accommodations on board the ships that he designed. For an additional fee, first-class passengers could enjoy all the pomp and luxury they'd come to expect from any Ritz establishment while steaming at some 23 knots across the vast Atlantic Ocean. The restaurant was fully staffed and managed by Ritz employees and functioned as an entirely separate entity from the rest of the victualling services on board. This ensured that guests were treated to the same unmatched quality as any other Ritz restaurant they would have found in Paris, New York, or London. On Imperator, the Ritz restaurant appeared to be less of a dining establishment and something more like a Baroque theatre, with the restaurant elevated on a stage-like platform and divided from the equally sumptuous Winter Garden lounge via a carpeted staircase. This arrangement of an elevated dining space with onlookers peeking in from the lounge below provided diners with a sense of privilege and nobility. To dine at the finest restaurant, on the finest vessel at sea, on what felt to be a grand stage. But of course, Mauretania provided the Imperator with much more than a fine dining option. Also notable on board the ship was the inclusion of the largest gymnasium ever seen at sea to that point in the extremely popular Pompeian-style pool, which towered 2 decks in height and sported massive ornate columns with gold detailing and marble benches. Mauretania must have been quite proud of this design because it's almost an exact replica of the same that he'd implemented for the Royal Automobile Club. Now, this in itself was a departure from the Spartan, bare steel, and boring tiling found in the pool areas on board ships like the Olympic class. The pool area connected to a Turkish and electric bath, massage rooms, a hair salon, and a sauna. Beyond this, Imperator was known for offering staterooms that were far more spacious than those offered by Cunard or White Star's ships. Gone were the days of cramped berths and tiny portholes. Rooms were now bright, open, and more comfortable than ever before. It was the design of the first-class lounge that seemed to suggest a rather novel concept for the time, a room built specifically with ample room for entertainment. Mauretania seemingly designed the lounge with a new philosophy. While there were still spaces which offered men and women seclusion on board the ship, the brightly lit, wide open space of the first-class lounge seemed to invite couples and families to socialise together. At 72 feet, that's 22 metres long, and with its massive dance floor and little in the way of partitions or columns, men and women alike were encouraged to use all the space that they could, and this included for musical and theatrical performances on a large stage at one end of the hall, which was the first of its kind seen on a liner. The interior design on Imperator was a testament to Germany's determination to excel over their British counterparts in as many aspects as possible. Almost every first-class stateroom was an outside cabin, with its own porthole, and 150 had their own ensuite bathrooms. 2 imperial suites, reserved for the richest of the rich, comprised no fewer than 12 rooms each, including a breakfast room, a sitting room, private promenade, and even a servant's quarters. Imperator even had her own florist shop. Of course, first class boasted all the finest accommodation, but as ever the standard of luxury was maintained across the rest of the ship. For the first time on an Oceanliner, second-class passengers got their own gym. There was a music room, smoking rooms, lounges. Second class on Imperator was as good as first class on almost every other Oceanliner then in service. But just as Imperator was being completed, Cunard Line dealt Hamburg America a blow. It came to light that the Aquitania was being designed to be longer on completion than the Imperator by a single foot length. Now, not content to take home second place once again, but with nowhere near enough time to adjust the ship's design for additional length, a quick fix was decided on by the company that would both solve the issues of Imperator's inadequate length and also serve as a symbol of Germany's seafaring might. Designed by Professor Bruno Kruse of Berlin, a massive bronze eagle displaying the words "My field is the world" was affixed to the ship's prow, its wings outstretched, and a globe held in its talons. In a funny twist, it would ultimately prove unnecessary. Aquitania was never designed to be longer than the Imperator. It was just a simple misunderstanding. Finally, by May 1913, Hamburg America Line was proud to introduce their flagship. It had been an achievement unparalleled in the history of German engineering up to that point. But as ever with breaking new ground, there came unintended consequences. Making her way down the Elbe River towards the North Sea for the first time, she quickly ran aground, a result of her staggering size contending with the narrow channel. Worse still, a fire on board, started by a workman accidentally, claimed the lives of 5 crewmen, and the damage would delay Imperator's maiden voyage. But critically, it also became clear during her short initial sea trials that the imposing hulk of the ship made her very top-heavy. The crew noticed the ship's tendency to roll easily where she would seem to hang, hesitant to return to an even keel. These design flaws would need to be addressed, but there was no time to go back to the drawing board and add any permanent fix for the instability issues. Imperator would need to be delivered to Hamburg America Line, top-heavy though she was, in anticipation of her highly publicised maiden voyage. As completed, Imperator was 8 feet longer than Aquitania, 7,000 tons larger, and capable of carrying a staggering 1,200 more passengers. The first few voyages on board Imperator were lauded by the public, who praised her lavish interiors, hotel-like atmosphere, comfortable staterooms, and beautifully designed public spaces. Slowly though, word began to spread around that life on board this floating palace was not what it appeared to be. Over the first few weeks of her sailing, passengers began to get increasingly frustrated with the ship's tendency to roll to one side at the slightest breeze. The ship's designers had anticipated some degree of instability in the ship, and they had installed an innovative system of anti-rolling water tanks within the hull that could be used to counterbalance the ship. The issue was, the system required the crew to anticipate the rolling ahead of time. This was nearly impossible to do so. There was no telling when the wind would blow just the right way to knock the hull off centre, so the anti-rolling system did precious little to remedy the problem. Many passengers insisted that the vessel never sailed on an even keel throughout her first season. It quickly became clear that the ship's top-heavy construction, coupled with damage from fires having occurred on board during her first few months, could not be easily repaired between voyages. To address these issues, Imperator needed a full refit only 1 season into her career. This would see her towering funnels shortened, heavy furniture be replaced with lighter wicker alternatives, and bulky wood panelling be replaced with lightweight fireproof sheeting. Now, the changes to the interior design would probably have been an affront to Charles Mouves, the man very particular about details and faithful to his Ritz-style design choices. But fire prevention systems were installed too, a response to the ship's desire to seemingly want to catch a blaze at random. All told, this refit would wind up costing the shipyard hundreds of thousands of marks on top of the already staggering cost of the construction, and the stability problems largely persisted for the remainder of her career. It earned the ship the embarrassing nickname L'Imperator. It's important to note that Imperator was essentially a prototype. Hamburg America Line wanted to take the ideals of luxury and might and blow them up on a scale never before seen, but unfortunately this came at the expense of the ship's stability. Despite these teething troubles, the ship drew an impressive number of passengers during her early days at sea. She was a triumph for her builders and designers, and a momentous feat by the German mercantile marine, who had proven that they could compete with the British shipping juggernauts. But even then, word was beginning to spread of the impending introduction of Imperator's planned sister ship. With the maiden voyage of Imperator, the Hamburg America Line was officially a force to be reckoned with. Now, they had to repeat the success. Ballin had always known that one ship would not be enough. He would need to take the lessons learned on Imperator and improve on the ship's design. The second in the trio would do just this, and in May 1914, the enormous hull of the new ship steamed into New York for the first time. Her bow featured gorgeous, ornate scrollwork that elegantly pointed towards her nameplate. It was a name that represented Germany itself. The new ship had been named Vaterland. At 950 feet in length, 53,500 gross registered tons, and capable of thundering through the water at a speed of 26 knots, she quickly outpaced Imperator as the largest and grandest liner afloat. She benefited from the lessons learned during the design of that ship as well. It was noted by many that Vaterland was far more stable than her constantly rolling running mate. But something important had happened in between the time that Albert Ballin's giants had been ordered and then finally introduced. Titanic had sunk. This shocked the world's maritime industries into action because the public had suddenly lost confidence in the safety of the Oceanliner as a whole. But Ballin's ships benefited from the Titanic disaster. Lessons had been learned and implemented as the ships were being built. There were some easy fixes. Imperator and Vaterland were two of the earliest ships to set to sea with lifeboats for all, as new, but that wasn't enough. The interiors of the ships featured double bottoms, inner skins and compartmentalization that far exceeded what had been used on Titanic. Wanting to assure an anxious public that these new and innovative German liners were the height of safety and security, Vaterland was put through a daunting test. Before her sea trials, the ship was brought out to deep ocean, where 1/3 of her watertight compartments were allowed to flood. Watching nervously as the vessel took on water, the shipbuilders and crew held their breath as the integrity of their work was tested in real time before their eyes. The trial was a success. Vaterland remained afloat, but while the test did prove the apparent safety of the ship, many builders agreed that it was one of the most extreme trials that a ship had been put through in history. Pumping the massive volume of seawater out was another undertaking altogether. Regardless, the experiment was an effective display of the Vaterland's safety and strength. Had she been the ship to face Titanic's iceberg on that cold April night back in 1912, Vaterland would have stayed afloat. Not only that, but the ship carried 83 lifeboats. Titanic had only carried 20. But it wasn't just safety lessons that had been learned either. Ballin and Mauves wanted to take the work they'd done with Imperator and push it to the extreme. The ship had benefited from having only 3 funnels. It meant that her interior rooms were some of the largest at sea. Ballin wanted to implement an ingenious engineering trick that would mean Vaterland's interiors would be even bigger. On most ships of the day, the funnel uptakes carried smoke from the ship's boilers through the middle of the ship, but Vaterland's uptakes were split. They'd rise from the boilers at the bottom of the ship, run outwards towards the hull, then run up and meet again at the funnel's base at the very top. This created a massive interior space that was uninterrupted by machinery or uptake casings. Vaterland would feature all the glorious spaces Imperator had, but now passengers could walk through them, one to the next, unimpeded in a giant kind of sprawling vista. If the goal was to make travellers forget they were on a ship at all, then Hamburg America was nailing the brief. These ships had evolved far beyond what you would ever expect to find on a vessel even a decade or so prior, with size, scale, luxury and safety all dwarfing shipboard offerings that had, once upon a time, been considered a triumph. Charles Mauves' business partner offered his insight to the Royal Institute of British Architects. He said, "If we could get ships inside to look like ships and get people to enjoy the sea, it would be a very good thing. But all we can do, as things are, is to give them giant floating hotels." No other pair of running mates at the time embodied this philosophy better than the Imperator and the Vaterland. Vaterland's 4,050 passengers would be fed by 8 enormous kitchens. She shipped 45,000 pounds of fresh meat alone. That's over 20,000 kilograms per voyage. In her pantries and bars were stored 17,500 bottles of wine and champagne, and no less than 28,000 litres of German beer. These German responses to British supremacy at sea seemed to be a resounding success. Once the third and final sister ship was completed and put into service, Cunard and Hamburg America Line would be the only 2 shipping companies on the transatlantic run to be operating a 3 superliner fleet. This likely would have been a sore spot for White Star. The Olympic class, of course, had been planned as a trio, but the loss of Titanic and the delay on Britannic because of that meant that they would never see their 3 grand sister ships running side by side. For a brief time, this war for transatlantic supremacy and the passenger trade was reaching a fever pitch. The world waited anxiously to see how White Star and Cunard would respond to the Grand Ballin trio once the final ship took to the sea. Unfortunately though, a different kind of war was on the horizon. This one would not be fought with specifications, design flourishes, or top-tier service. This was the dawn of the First World War, and the era of Edwardian luxury superliners was about to come to a crashing halt. World War I broke out just a year into Imperator's career, and barely a month after Vaterland's maiden voyage. The world's attitude towards shipping had shifted overnight. Grand and gilded liners designed as floating hotels, whisking travellers away across the ocean, were now seen as accessories of wartime. Once immaculate liveries were painted over in drab camouflage colours, guns were affixed on decks, ammunition filled cargo holds. Lookouts were now trained to not only watch for icebergs or rocks, but the approach of enemy vessels, torpedoes, and submarines. Albert Ballin, with his incredible foresight, had seen the writing on the wall. He had anticipated the possibility of naval hostilities destroying his many years of hard work. In the years leading up to the war, Ballin had tried to act as a mediator between the Germans and the British, having sensed the diplomacy between the two sides beginning to break down. Ballin hoped that Britain and Germany could reach an agreement where the two nations would continue to compete with one another only in the transatlantic passenger trade, rather than devolving into a full-out naval arms race. Try as he might though, in July of 1914, Britain and Germany found themselves on opposite ends of the largest contest of military might the world had ever seen. The Oceanliner was going to war, and things would never be the same. While 80 of Hamburg America's 175 ships were docked at German ports when the war had started, 12 liners were docked in neutral ports, and they were almost immediately confiscated. To Albert Ballin's absolute dismay, one of those ships was the Vaterland. While Imperator was back in Germany, home and safe, Vaterland had been docked at New York at the start of the war, with the captain unwilling to take his ship on a mad dash across a dangerous Atlantic Ocean for home port. Vaterland was summarily confiscated by the United States and mothballed at Hoboken, New Jersey. While hundreds of thousands fought and died on the European continent, America began to realize that it might need to get its own troops across the Atlantic Ocean. A giant German ocean liner would be the perfect transport. Vaterland was converted into a troop ship to serve in the US war effort, making her known as one of the world's largest prisoners of war. She was even renamed. The Americans called her USS Leviathan. Having sat idle for the better part of 3 years, in December 1917, after the US had finally entered the war, Leviathan set off on her first voyage, carrying over 7,000 American troops. In subsequent voyages, this number would be increased to a staggering 14,000 troops. But this was only possible because the beautiful interiors of the ship had been ripped out. The darling of the German fleet was largely stripped of her finery. Her grand dining room had been converted into a mess hall. The famous ballroom and social halls had been converted into a hospital. The marble halls of the Romanesque swimming pool now served as a baggage hold. And being the largest ship at sea, and one of the fastest, worked to her advantage in wartime. She was free to travel without the need of an escort or convoy, because it was believed that she could simply outrun any U-boat that might try to target her. At the same time, Albert Ballin was dealing with struggles of his own. His attempts to mediate between Germany and Britain had failed. He had to watch on helplessly as the war had spelled the end to his record-breaking trio of ships. The third sister ship had been well underway at the start of the war, but now she sat languishing, stripped of copper and brass for the war effort. It was a pathetic and heartbreaking sight. Ballin had grand plans. He was a dreamer, fiercely proud of his creations, but world events had turned his dreams into a waking nightmare. His relationship with the Kaiser, with whom he'd always enjoyed a great deal of camaraderie, was beginning to sour, and word was beginning to spread that Ballin was not a supporter of the war effort, and it was no longer beneficial for the Kaiser to keep Ballin close. In 1918, the two were no longer on speaking terms. With his world falling apart and his greatest ship yet, the Vaterland, stripped of her splendor and in American hands, it all proved too much. Albert Ballin died of an overdose in 1918, 2 days before the war ended. Shockingly, his death received almost no coverage from the German press because it had been overshadowed by the magnitude of world events. By the end of the war, Hamburg-America Line, like the rest of Germany, was in a shocking state. It would take many years before the company could stand on its own 2 feet again, having been completely obliterated by the war and the loss of their genius leader. It was a tragic end for what had been a glorious undertaking. But even though Ballin's dreams would go unfulfilled, his gift to the world was a trio of spectacular ships that had pushed the limit and driven the development of the Oceanliner even further. And even though this was the close of one chapter of these ships' stories, a curious twist would see the Ballin ships receive a second chance at life. The war had not been kind to the world's merchant navies. Hundreds had been sunk and some household names had been lost. Lusitania was spectacularly sunk in 1915. She had been a floating celebrity for nearly a decade. Her loss was a massive blow for the Cunard line, who were relying on her to form part of their grand trio of transatlantic liners. White Star Line copped a devastating blow too. Britannic, intended to be the running mate to Olympic, was lost after she hit a mine in 1916. The massive ships would need to be replaced, and there, lying at anchor, were 2 of Ballin's giants. Imperator had sat mothballed at Hamburg for 4 years, and the 3rd ship was unfinished, still with her funnels unattached. As always in wartime, to the victor goes the spoils. America would keep Vaterland, now Leviathan, as a war reparation, while Britain would take ownership of the other 2 sisters. For the German merchant marine, it was a devastating blow, but nothing could be done. As 1918 rolled into 1919, and then 1920, the world slowly began to recover from the horror of the war, and plans were drawn up for the Ballin ships. His trio would live on, but they would never serve together, and instead, they would be pitched against one another in foreign hands, as rivals. (1921), the second year of a new decade. The bleakness of the war had slowly begun to give way to a new era. It was the birth of the Jazz Age. In America, the Volstead Act had been passed and prohibition had begun. At sea, the great shipping companies had been hard at work. The end of the war presented new opportunities because suddenly hundreds of thousands of European people sought to move to escape the war's carnage and seek new lives. As ever, the great British shipping companies were at the forefront. Aquitania and Mauretania were put to work, earning a fortune and transporting thousands. But sailing alongside them was a new addition. With enormous red funnels, you might have thought, looking on, that this might have been a sister ship to Aquitania, if not for one obvious difference. The ship didn't have 4 funnels, she only had 3. The massive liner had been dreamt up a decade ago by a German genius, but now she was one of the biggest ships in the British merchant marine. Her name had once been Imperator, but now, flying the blue ensign and the Cunard House flag, her gilt letters spelt out a different name. The name of an English queen. She was called Berengaria. Since 1914, Imperator had remained tied up at Hamburg, occasionally being stripped of some expensive bronze fixtures while being largely left to rust. After the war, she was briefly handed over to the US under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and used as a transport to bring American troops home alongside her sister ship, Leviathan. But just a few short months later, Imperator was given back to the British shipping controller. Because the Cunard line had suffered at the hands of Germany's U-boat fleet, they needed a replacement for Lusitania, and Imperator, they got it. The ship was handed over, and she flew the British flag. And after a series of lackluster voyages as the RMS Imperator, it became clear that the ship was in dire need of an overhaul. In 1921, she went in for 6 long months and re-emerged, refreshed, the largest ship in Cunard's fleet. But sadly, the Ritz-Carlton restaurant, Moues's pride and joy, didn't make it. The space was gutted and turned instead to a dance floor, truly a sign of the times as the Jazz Age took over. But probably the biggest change came to the ship's power plant. As built, Imperator had carried thousands of tons of coal, which needed to be shoveled by hand by over 100 stokers. But a new technology would change all of this: fuel oil. Now ship's boilers could burn liquid fuel instead, It didn't need to be shoveled in, it could be pumped from tanks. And refueling had been a days-long process, but now it could be done in a matter of hours. The ship's boilers were overhauled and the bunkers could ship 6,500 tons of liquid fuel. Eventually, virtually all major coal-fired ocean liners like Olympic and Aquitania would get the same treatment. The age of coal at sea was over, and a new technological age had begun. Meanwhile, many of the other changes Cunard made had been with weight saving in mind. Despite efforts from her original builders, Berengaria was still top-heavy and quite a roller. Tons of cement and pig iron were laid in the ship's bottom to try to keep her on an even keel, and most of the furniture was replaced with more modern, lightweight pieces. The end result was a refreshed liner that carried most of Imperator's pre-war splendor. She became a popular choice for travellers who spent many nights of the 1920s dancing away to the ship's onboard orchestras. She was Cunard Line's flagship and sailed wearing the company's colours for 18 years. But of course, she was not British built. A strange fact which didn't matter much to the travelling public. Berengaria was still a very happy ship. You can see it in the thousands of photos of happy passengers dressed in their best. At last, Cunard Line was operating a regular 3-liner service across the Atlantic with Mauretania, Aquitania, and Berengaria. A strange lineup, but a proud one nonetheless. For Cunard Line, the 1920s would be happy years, thanks in large part to Berengaria, but the ship's younger sister, Vaterland, wouldn't be so lucky. After the First World War, Vaterland, renamed Leviathan, had worked hard to transport thousands of troops across the Atlantic to bring them home to America. The ship, like her sister, developed a bit of a reputation for rolling, and on long crossings, American troops would tell the same joke. "There's a torpedo," one would shout, and someone would reply, "Thank God." They just wanted to be put out of their misery as they swayed back and forth. Leviathan did her job just fine and earned the nickname the Big Train, but by war's end, she was clearly clapped out. The ship had been basically brand new before the war and had only completed 4 Atlantic crossings under the German flag, but by 1920 she was clearly very tired. Not only that, but tastes had already begun to change, and by the 1920s, the ship, which was naturally very German, was unlikely to appeal to an American traveller. She'd need to be extensively overhauled, and a simple refresh just wouldn't cut it. Structural changes would need to be made, but to do this, the Americans needed plans. And here there was a problem, because Blohm and Voss, the original German builders, were holding the ship's plans ransom. They offered to sell them for $15 million in today's money, which was, at the time, an outrageous sum, and the new US owners simply balked at it. They'd have to get creative. They'd have to make their own plans, and to do it, they'd need to recruit a small army of men to measure every inch of the ship inside and out to draw a set of plans up from scratch. And to oversee the monumental effort, the United States Lines, the new owners, needed a keen eye and a cool head. They awarded the contract to a young, up-and-coming naval architect and his brother. The man's name was William Francis Gibbs, a quiet and determined young man who would one day go on to design one of history's greatest ships. But for now, he and his brother Frederick busied themselves with mapping Leviathan from the inside out and planning to rebuild the Teutonic liner as an American one. The task was staggering. Gibbs himself said, "There was nothing to go by but the ship herself. We knew nothing whatever about her. We did not even know where her centre of gravity was." It took a full year for Gibbs and his team to draft a monumental set of specifications, 1,024 pages long. 13 pages were dedicated to clock-face design alone. In 1923, half a decade since the war had ended, a ship emerged sporting the red, white, and blue funnels of the United States Lines. She had kept her wartime name, but now she had been finally restored to passenger-carrying glory. She was the SS Leviathan. William Francis Gibbs' attention to detail and genius rivaled that of Leviathan's creator, Albert Ballin. It had been a monumental task, but the Gibbs brothers, in conjunction with the Newport News Shipbuilding Company, had transformed the old Vaterland into what was essentially a different ship. The reconditioning took more than a year. Like her older sister, the liner had been converted to burn oil instead of coal, and all her interior wiring and plumbing had been ripped out and fully refurbished. Steam heating, new galley and cooking equipment, the old stuff had been taken out and new machinery put in. Even the engines needed a total overhaul. When she'd been converted into a troop ship, 1,200 staterooms had been ripped out, bathtubs had been removed by sledgehammer, cushions and furnishings had been simply tossed overboard, and leaded glass windows were smashed out. Art was looted and sold on the black market. Ballin's grandest liner had been reduced to a husk of its former self, and Gibbs had set about restoring her completely. The Ritz restaurant was stripped right back to bare steel and then reinstalled, but where a portrait of Prince Ludwig of Bavaria had hung in a public space, now a portrait of US President Warren G. Harding sat in its place. The spate of luxurious public rooms was all there, the lavish winter garden, the spacious ballroom. Leviathan entered service in summer 1923 to much fanfare. Gibbs and his team, as well as thousands of hands from the Newport News shipyard, had done it. They had taken the forlorn, poorly Vaterland and transformed her into a floating palace that Ballin, if he was still alive, might have been proud of, despite the fact that she was in US hands. American dock workers were unused to such a massive vessel. Upon her delivery at Boston Naval Dockyard, the men were taken aback by the massive size, with one tug captain shouting, "Where do you tie a line to this goddamn hotel?" Leviathan set out on what could be considered a third maiden voyage. She was by now almost a decade old, but had only served as a passenger liner for a few months. United States Lines had a flagship, and for the first time in decades, one of the largest passenger ships on the transatlantic run was American flagged. But what had started out as a glorious return to form quickly lost steam. Leviathan soon began to operate at a loss, and one key reason was drink. Being an American flagged ship during Prohibition, alcohol couldn't be served on board. The ship was still the pride of the American merchant fleet, and an ocean-going celebrity in her own right, but she would just never reach the same levels of success and popularity as her sister ships. Cunard and then United States Lines had both taken a Ballin's sister ship and repurposed them in different ways, but Ballin's ships had been intended to be a trio. Way back in 1912, when he'd been planning the third and final sister, he knew she would need to improve again on the formula that he'd set into place. Imperator had been praised for her lavish interiors. Vaterland had taken these interiors and scaled them up. And the third sister would be the culmination of Ballin's dream. She would be named Bismarck, after the great German statesman, and she would have embodied all of Germany's pride and engineering might. But tragically, for Ballin and for the nation as a whole, the First World War stopped her construction dead in its tracks. She had thundered down the slipway in 1914, but then sat for years, languishing as a hulk, incomplete, and even lacking her funnels. 5 years after work had been started, the rusted skeleton of Bismarck was confiscated by the British as a war reparation, but then acquired by none other than the White Star Line. That vaunted company had been dealt a devastating blow when they lost their own superliner Britannic to a German mine in 1916. And Bismarck, almost 10,000 tons larger, would be her replacement. White Star Line had worked for decades, having their ships built by the Harland & Wolff shipyard of Belfast, but that yard was almost 2,000 miles away by sea from where Bismarck had been laid up at Hamburg. But the German shipyard promised to finish the ship to the exacting standard as if she were going into German ownership, mostly to the original plans and specifications and almost exactly as Ballin had imagined her. But it would not be smooth sailing. In 1920, as work was going on, a fire mysteriously broke out that many thought was set by German workers. The fact that this proud nation was now forced to turn over its greatest creation yet was a massive blow. By 1922, the work was finally complete. Bismarck had been finished by Blohm and Voss, but in a final act of defiance, they had finished the ship in Hamburg America Line's German colour scheme. Once the immense ship was ready for official handover between Germany and Britain, it was found that there had been a few key details overlooked. British officials and the ship's new commander, the White Star Line veteran Bertram Hayes, had travelled to Germany to take possession, but then found that their quarters were still unfinished, but the quarters of the German crew were completed and spotless. Hayes' own cabin was being used to store wash basins. But despite the obvious rancour, Bismarck was handed over to the White Star Line and she steamed away for her sea trials. hundreds of locals watched in silence as their creations sailed off. Even though she flew the German flag for her trials, a report stated that the city's inhabitants watched the scene with aching hearts. Bismarck would be the largest ocean liner Germany would ever build, and the largest ship in the world, for 13 years. For the White Star Line, things were beginning to look up at last. A dream that had started years ago in 1907 was finally being realised. The company had wanted to introduce a trio of superliners for the prestigious New York service, but Titanic had been lost, and then so had Britannic. In the summer of 1922, they were at last able to introduce a suitable running mate to the sole surviving member of the class, Olympic. That ship had served valiantly for years, and now a decade after her debut, she had a strange kind of sister that wasn't British, but German-built. With her 3 towering smokestacks now sporting the White Star buff, the new liner looked resplendent. Gone was the name Bismarck. The new ship steamed for New York, for the first time proudly wearing the name Majestic. White Star Line's acquired liner was a triumph for the company. She was 10,000 tons larger than Olympic and vastly more spacious and luxurious. Olympic's interiors were like a stately British country manor, but to travel on Majestic was like staying at the Savoy or the Ritz. White Star was so impressed with Maures's interior designs that they incorporated his furnishings into the ship even though he had essentially designed them nearly a decade prior. There were all the same famous spaces as passengers had come to expect on Ballin's other ships. The towering lounge, free of columns and annoying pillars thanks to the genius of the ship's interior engineering. White Star had taken the opportunity to convert their ship to burn oil as well. Now all 3 of the Ballin ships had been modernised and burned the much more economical fuel. At full steam, Majestic, despite her immense bulk, was capable of hitting up to 26 or 27 knots, a testament to the sheer power of her engines and the efficiency of her shape. When she arrived in New York for the first time, she caused a stir. The old Mauretania dipped her flags in salute as she passed outbound, her decks crammed with passengers who were keen to get a glimpse of this new generation of ocean liner. Moored at the pier, with over 40 feet of her stern overhanging into the Hudson River, more than 10,000 people came out to see her. It was a fortunate sign. Majestic would prove to be a smashing success for the White Star Line. They would never quite introduce a third ship that could live up to the standards set by Olympic and Majestic, but the liners worked together for the rest of the 1920s, and the White Star Line flag flew high and proud across the Atlantic. The 1920s were a dizzying, heady era. On the one hand, it was a decade of merriment, partying, furious jazz, incredible wealth and decadence. But on the other hand, it was a decade of immense turmoil, the rise of dictators, an impending stock market crash. But through it all, Ballin's trio of ships operated not as running mates, but rivals. The maritime genius who had dreamt the giants up wasn't around to see them in their glory years. It's hard to just encapsulate in a video, even one as long as this, just what those years must have been like. A ship is a strange thing. It's like it has a beating heart and a soul. It's shaped out of steel and iron, but then it takes on a persona thanks partly to its insides and how it makes its passengers feel, but then also thanks to the thousands of workers, crew and staff who make it a home. Passengers would travel on certain liners because they knew and loved members of the crew. Some stewards who served on board Olympic, for example, had been there since its maiden voyage in 1911 to its scrapping in the 1930s. Ballin's 3 ships took on personas of their own too, and over the many years they were in service, there were countless human stories that played out. Love affairs, scandals, dances, fine dinners. Aboard there were celebrities, royalty, athletes, statesmen and migrants alike. The liners saw the beauty of the ocean in all of its moods, from the stillness of a fine sunset to the terrifying roar of an Atlantic winter storm. They battled waves that towered over their decks and dwarfed piers and tugboats on either side of the Atlantic. They were legends of their time, the very pinnacle of Edwardian engineering. But by the late 1920s, times had well and truly changed. Ballin's trio had been in service for 15 years, but they had not been easy years. The ships, all three of them, were beginning to show their age. During a reconditioning, Leviathan had had her wiring ripped out and replaced, but the other two sisters did not. As a result, they suffered fires and failures over the years, and then cracks in the shell plating began to show. Leviathan was hit by a wave so hard that it cracked some of her frames out of true and opened up a 100-foot tall gash in the hull. The size and majesty of these ships had lulled British shipbuilding into a strange kind of stupor. The intense race to build increasingly larger passenger ships that had taken place for decades before the war had eased off. Britain's great shipbuilders began to build more modest intermediate cabin liners. White Star and Cunard already had their superliners after all, and their old continental European rivals, like Germany, had been knocked out of the battle. Or at least they had, for a while. German shipbuilding and industry had been devastated by the end of the war, but it had not been halted forever. As the years passed and Germany found her feet again, one of the nation's premier lines began to make big plans. The winds of change were blowing. The 1920s were nearing their end, and the three most celebrated ships at sea were from a different age that no longer existed. Now, Art Deco reigned supreme. Tastes were always changing, and the British and American lines had been content to operate the Ballin ships without fear of contest. But now the company North German Lloyd set out to change this. The Oceanliner had risen from the 19th century as an alternative to the sailing ship. It had rocketed forward in leaps and bounds, but then, for 15 years, it remained largely unchanged in its basic form. What North German Lloyd was about to build would change the game forever. The Oceanliner was about to take a radical step forward into the future with a pair of sister ships that would shock the British into action and result in a series of vessels that would enter the history books. It would all culminate in the construction of true maritime legends and some of the most intense ocean-going rivalries of all time. Ballin's trio of ships had been a huge step forward for their time, but the Edwardian superliner was dying out. A new age was about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.